In this module, we're going to be reviewing exception deviation reporting. The first thing to understand here is, what are these exception reports used for? These exception reports are utilized during your formal system testing run. When the software has been frozen, the documentation has been approved, and as well as your test scripts. The test scripts have been approved. So this is a point of a regulated project where you are verifying software functionality in a functionally frozen environment. So in that case, if we do run into any issues, they need to be recorded. And so that's what these exception reports are designed to do. They are very different than defects that are entered into our JIRA defect system. We can write defects as a result of these, which we will discuss in a few moments. But these are not to be confused with entering defects into our defect tracking database. Okay, so filling out the form. The first thing we're going to document here is the application, and so whether it's the portal, desktop agent, etc., you're going to basically write the application that we were testing, as well as the version number of that application. The next field here is the reference to the change request. The next field here is to record whether it's an exception report or a deviation report. They are very different in that exception reports are typically designed to record some sort of error or defect, where a deviation report is sort of like a note to file, where nothing has really failed, but you need to go around a certain element of the process for whatever reason, or you need to deviate from the original validation report or validation plan that was written. And we need to record that. We need to record the deviation, why we did it, and basically the results of that. The next field here would be where you would record the deviation number, and this is very straightforward, as it's just your initials followed by a sequential number starting at 1, which can be reset or reused for every single validation that you do. All exception reports are closed out as part of a validation effort, and so again, once a validation is closed, then these are basically in the design history file, and so the next time you do a test run and you have to write an exception report, you can start that again at 1, and then just move it up sequentially depending on how many of these you need to write up. The next section here is issue details or reference, and this field is where you're going to briefly describe what was expected and what was the result. So again, we want to record, why are we writing this? What was expected? And what did we get? What was the actual result? The fields over here to the right are to reference the test rail, basically the test rail test that you were executed against. And so this starts with the high-level suite, the plan, the run, the case, the instance, and the step. TestRail is a little bit complicated on how it manages its tests, and so there's a lot of references in here that need to be recorded. Because it is so complicated, we do require that all those references do get recorded, so that we can trace things in the future. Again, if these are if these are confusing to you, then I would recommend going back and reviewing TestRail so that you're clear on what plans are, what runs are, especially since TestRail uses the R for both tests and plans, runs and plans. And so again, just become really familiar with the architecture of a test case in TestRail so that you can fill this out. The next section is root cause analysis, and so this is where we record the root cause of the issue. Really this boils down to three different things that can happen with some sort of hierarchy of other items which we need to check off as needed. The first here is requirement implementation. This is very rarely used. This is a very high level issue where the testing, you discover that the system isn't even meeting its requirements, or that it wasn't even implemented correctly. And so these can be pretty significant issues where you're basically testing something that you feel doesn't even meet the requirement. And so again, we don't use these very often. If we get to this point in a project where everything's locked down and you're doing final system testing, and we discover that we never even designed it to the expectations, then yeah, we've got a big problem. So this isn't used very often. The next one is used much more often, which is your testing problem. Testing problems can be broken up into functional failure, which basically means the system or application doesn't work, or preparation error, which basically means that your test script is incorrect. Now, we want to keep in mind here that obviously you're testing against code that needs to be correct, or the system isn't going to function. However, in a regulated environment, your test scripts are just as valuable as the code that they are testing. So no matter how big or small the error might be in your written test script, if there's a problem, if your expected results, if this doesn't all work out at the end when you're done executing your test, whether your test is written wrong or whether you have a functional failure, then we need to write up an exception report, because again, your test scripts are just as important as the code. That happens to be the most common reason for us to write up an exception report, is for test script errors. So again, in that case, we would say you've got a testing problem, there's a preparation error, and that there's a test script error, which means there's something, there's an issue in your test script. There are some other items here that are less commonly used, but again, this is your most common path. And you want to make sure that we do have all these checked off. Common error is to forget one of these, one of the parent checkboxes here, and we do want to make sure that those are all checked off. The next box in here is for executor error. Again, these aren't used that commonly. There's a whole bunch of different scenarios on why we would write one of these, but the most common one would be if either down the road while you're reviewing and or if someone else is reviewing your tests, it's discovered that you failed a test step that didn't really fail, that you made the mistake, that it was an executor error. And so at that case, now you've got, in that situation, now you've got a record of you failing a test case that in many cases can't be reversed because we are in a regulated environment. So now you're going to go back and you're going to write an exception report that says that really passed even though I failed it. And so then we would go ahead and we would write that up as executor error. Again, because we use these reports for a lot of different things, you see we have a lot of fields in here where there's other. And we want to make sure that in any cases where we aren't utilizing it, that we write either NA, not applicable, not required, that there's something in this space, because we never want to leave anything blank. These exception reports will be kicked back for you to correct these and re-sign them if there's any blanks. It's a very important legal good documentation practice that no fields are left blank. The other common mistake that I see some testers typically make is we don't check this off unless there's something in here. And something in here does not necessarily mean that you're NAing it. So this should remain unchecked unless you're actually utilizing the field for something. Okay. The next column or next section here is your severity analysis, and so it's either a minor, major, or critical. Minor is obviously most common. Most of these you're going to write these reports and sort of just move on, but we need to document them. Majors, typically more significant software issue, in which case, especially if you're going to not correct this before release, that you want to make sure you well document why you made the decision to release with a major issue. If engineering has classified this as major, then and you're going to release it, we need to make sure we document why we released it. Typically, these are all going to need to have some sort of workaround, and you're going to either release note them and or include them in other documentation. Critical issues, the system just does not function as intended. There is no workaround for the end user, and with these issues we don't release. And it's really important that when many times we'll run into issues like this during a system testing run. We'll report them to engineering will go ahead and fix it, and then we'll just move on, and we won't write one of these reports. It's very important that if you run into any issues while you're testing, that these reports do get written up, despite how long or even short it might take for engineering to address them. Because again, if we're fixing issues, we're updating code and retesting, and it's really important to record that when we're in a quote-unquote controlled environment. Again, your system testing phases should be a very, very controlled environment, which is why we have these reports. Your recommended actions. So what are we going to do? Up to this point, we've sort of identified the issue. Here's where we're actually going to state, all right, so what are we actually going to do? And this is broken up into items that we might do before we deploy and items that we might do after we deploy. Now, it's very important that we do check off both of these, and even if there's nothing that we're going to do for each of these, it is important that we record that. Because obviously when we do these exception reports, we're going to do something before we deploy it, and then we're going to do something after. And even if that something is nothing, that's really important even to document that in these types of reports. So again, going with the most common scenario that we mentioned before, let's say we have a simple test script error, in which case prior to deployment we would just continue testing. We're not going to really do anything at that point unless it's a really significant rewrite of many test cases, or we just, the test engineer just completely missed the boat on something, and then in that case we might want to go through the effort of updating the test scripts, and in which case then we would have to reapprove them before we re-execute them. But in most cases, we don't want to hold up a whole validation project just because of some error in one test script. So we're going to continue testing, but write this report. The end result is that we are going to correct the test script after we deploy. And so in that case, we're going to go ahead and we're going to revise the test script post-deployment. And so we're going to go ahead and check that. Then as we move on with this scenario, we're going to retest. And again, in not all cases do we need to retest. However, these checkboxes are set up to try to capture as many scenarios as possible, with the caveat that's always there that we can use other if need be. But again, these should capture most of the situations that you would run into. And in the case of a simple test script error, there is no retesting. It's just continue. So again, original testing continued with noted deviation. Not applicable. Testing continued with noted deviation. Now, if we were going to go ahead and address a software defect, then the situation here would be a little different, because prior to deployment we would need to go ahead and we would need to fix the defect, and then we would need to, and then in this case there may actually not be any post-deployment because the issue was corrected during validation, and or maybe we did triage it. And if we did triage it, then again we would say that the defect fix is required post post-deployment, in which case it would be continue pre. So again, you're going to always do something either pre or post, and in some cases it may be nothing in one or the other, but we need to document that. Again, and you may, if it is a defect fix, we're going to want to go ahead and we're going to retest, either using the original script or maybe we had to revise it. And again, conditions. So again, I'm not going to go through all the different scenarios here, but I think hopefully you get it at this point. Final resolution, closeout. So we've gone through the whole process of describing the issue, referencing it back to the case and the step, doing a root cause on why it happened, going ahead, categorizing it, stating what we're going to do about it. If there was retesting, saying that we were going to retest it, but now we got to close it. And so this particular section is tied to some signatures. And so in order to close it, we need to do various things. And again, this is left pretty much open depending on the situation, with a lot of NAs in here if it's not applicable. So in the case of updating a test script, you're going to want to go ahead and you're going to want to do a JIRA ticket here. So let's say we need to go ahead and update a desktop agent test script because there was a test script error. Well, this is where we're going to say that we're not going to fix the test script now, but we're going to go ahead and we're going to we're going to go ahead and we're going to revise the test script post deployment. Okay, and so since we're going to do that, because we're in a regulated environment and we need to close this exception report before we close the validation, we can't just say, all right, we're going to revise a test script and then just close it and not look at it again. We have to go ahead and create some sort of task so that we can make sure that we actually do update the test script post deployment. And that's where we would go ahead and we would create a defect in our defect tracking system, which is JIRA. So in this case, we're triaging. And so we're triaging into the quote-unquote permanent defect system, which is JIRA, and this will get, again, resolved after deployment. Now, the trick here now is you need to make sure that these do get resolved, because auditors will go and they'll look at these exception reports and they'll say, all right, you closed the exception, you triaged it out to your JIRA, but now show me defect number DA545 and show me that you actually addressed that and closed it. So we need to make sure that when we do this, that they don't just go into a black hole somewhere, that they do get addressed post deployment. Again, retesting if there was any. If the retest required evidence, which you always want to collect evidence especially when you're retesting, I would even err on the side of collecting more evidence than the original test script even asked for, because again, you're making sure that a discovered defect has been corrected. So again, if there was retesting, it was completed, and then that's at the point where you're going to attach the evidence to this report. If we're just checking the evidence into Subversion, which we do in most cases, then it's just capturing screenshots that are going to get put into the same folder as this report. If there is no retesting because it was just a software, or sorry, a test script error, then this would be just NA. Okay. Any documentation. So let's just say we had a major issue and we need to put it in the release notes. We might say it was completed here, and we would reference the release notes. In most cases, this is going to be NA. Okay. Again, if we need to record something else, corrective actions. Again, this is a field that's very rarely used, and it's designed for if we discover something really major where there's some sort of process issue that needs to be corrected at the process level, then we would go ahead and we would create a CAPA. But again, we don't use that very often. And then any additional comments that would be of value to this exception report. Then you go ahead and sign it as the executor, and then forward it to the reviewer. In 90% of the cases is going to be compliance, regulatory compliance. It's not the SQA manager and or another SQA engineer. It's typically compliance, because it's the person that's actually going to go ahead and close the validation, which would be your compliance representative. So again, that goes through completing an exception report. Very, very briefly, I just want to review a completed exception report here so that you just get a quick idea of what these look like when they're completed. Here's again the application, the version, the reference to the change requests. This was an exception report. Here is the author's initials, the description, all your references to your test rail information. This was again, most common, a test script error. The test engineer did not check this off, which I just noticed, and it got through. So again, this needs to be checked off. NA for the others. Again, making sure all that's there. This particular one, prior to deployment, we just continued testing because it's a test script error. After post-deployment, now one thing you'll notice here is that it does not say revised test script, because this was a very particular test case that was very specific to this database, and it was decided that that test case wasn't going to be executed again. So because that test case is going to basically be obsoleted, and they made the decision that there was no reason to go update it, then that we documented that. And that's very important to document things like that. If it doesn't follow through on one of these checkboxes, then chances are it needs to be an other, and it needs to be written in. Retest documentation requirements. Again, original testing continued. Not applicable for retest conditions. No JIRA ticket to record updating the test script post-deployment, because the test engineer stated that we're not going to update it because it's going to be obsolete or not used again. No retesting. No references to external documentation. No CAPA. And again, this was really good of the test engineer to state here, test cases will be removed and no longer applied to future testing. So again, they made it clear that we do not need to update these test scripts. Signed by the test engineer, signed by compliance, and this report was closed out for this validation.